Even though I have moved away from my family and the hubbub of the spiritual practices, in my heart I've never really left it. Some of the beliefs that I honor now and I feel have become part of my own identity are things like pacifism, and particularly disarmament. I really feel strongly about disarmament. The garage piece that commemorated the gun slaying of 16 children was done in response to that, and brought to mind the philosophy of Doukhobors have held for a long time, that the welfare of the world is not worth the life of one child.
One of my creative writing instructors said to me one day, well, this is a good short story, but to make it really great, change the characters, Doukhobor characters, give them the Russian names. And of course, I wasn't self-confident enough to do that at that time, because being Doukhobor is to lack confidence because of all the conflicts and things happening, and the perception people have of the Doukhobors as a culture. So it took me about 2 or 3 years to realize that maybe this is what I should be doing. You know, once I made that decision, I was sorry I hadn't made it sooner.
When the Doukhobors refused military service and burned all their guns on June the 29th, 1895, they went through quite a bit of persecution. And most of the people then learned this song, which gave them a lot of comfort. It was for thy sake, O Lord, that I left all my earthly belongings, that I live in privation and persecution. It is for thy sake, O Lord, that I willingly bear slanderous accusations and degradations. For thy sake, O Lord, that I go about in hunger and in thirst. And it is for thy sake, O Lord, that I have to live without shelter. The Lord be praised.
I've been haunted for a long time by images and family photo albums. There's an incredible soul quality and idealistic expression in the faces of the people in photographs. It's almost as though they led this very idealistic way of life, and as though utopia was just around the corner. And I know now that their lives weren't really like that, but what comes through is this incredible idealism, I suppose, in the face of hardship.
I am weary, I weep, I wrap myself in silence. I am alone among friends. I hear the sounds their mouths make, but not their voices. The symbols are in place, but the meaning is gone. This is what comes of wrestling with angels. I think, for Doukhobors, it's more wrestling with your own spirit. And that is a struggle for moving past what is depressing and into what is sorrowful and joyful both.
Знаешь, Боже, мое желание, мои молитвы слышишь ты.
Canada's Doukhobors are the descendants of 18th century Russian pacifists. Their history has been passed on orally through complex hymns sung in archaic Russian. Today, Doukhobor writers and artists are beginning to tell their stories to the outside world.
My father was a great storyteller, and he had a very colorful life, being born in the Caucasus area in one province, and at the age of 2.5 migrating to another province, which he remembered, and then at the age of 21 being called up for army service, which he refused. Then he was exiled to Siberia. The trek to Siberia at that time was a matter of 10,000 kilometers. The Doukhobors didn't go to Siberia. They all came to Canada. And of course, when my dad and his chums came to Canada 6 years later, there was always these stories that the Siberian exiles could tell. So that got my interest from a small age yet that I would be writing sometimes. There were some books being written about the Doukhobors, and especially there was a lot of newspaper and other media that did not bring out the Doukhobors in a proper light. So I was somehow prompted from my inside to write a book from the Doukhobors themselves rather than somebody write about them. I had chosen then this particular lady, Tanya. She happens to be actually my wife's grandmother's sister. She was born in the first part of the 1870s. She lived 100 years and then some. So I thought in her life, I'll bring out the thoughts of the Doukhobors just as they were through her eyes, and the history and the philosophy of the Doukhobors. Doukhobor, speaking is a voice of the intellect, singing is the voice of the soul. That is why Doukhobor is incumbent upon him to know the things that he's singing by heart, so that it's in your intellect already. Then you can express your soul, sing from your soul. And in order to have group communion of the soul, you sing together. And to sing together is also an expression of how you should live together. If you're singing, then you have to, of needs, go along with the person that's next to you so you don't make a discord. Same with the next person and the next person. And then you have a whole congregation that tries to be in unison. And then that is brought into everyday living. But the Doukhobors feel that you have this soul communion when you get together. Doukhoborism, it could not really be classed as a religion or a social movement. It's the best explanation of it is sort of just a life concept that continually has the chance to evolve.
Pacifism is at the heart of the Doukhobor life concept, and it was pacifism that drove the Doukhobors into exile. Persecuted in Russia for their beliefs, the Doukhobors looked for a place of refuge and found it in Canada. 7,000 Russian Doukhobors arrived in 1899, inspired by the promise of religious freedom. The Canadian government needed farmers to settle northern Saskatchewan. Here, the Doukhobors quickly built thriving communities centered at Verrigan, a village named after Peter Verrigan, the beloved Doukhobor leader who first brought them to Canada. The large prayer home at Verrigan still stands, but it's now a museum, a pilgrimage site for modern Doukhobors.
The central area of the Doukhobor, their administration was right here. And the prayer home was the residence of Peter Verrigan, and this is where he met his business partner. We had a community store, a dry goods store, and a big building here with administration offices. There was a big library. There was a congregation room for meetings. Here there was a barn, and just west up here of the ground was a brick factory. And just south of the brick factory was a bit of a village, and beyond that was a dam, an elevator, and a flour mill. And the trains would be able to unload and load and be gone.
These early Doukhobor communities were built on a spiritual foundation and utopian values. The Doukhobors were strict vegetarians. They lived communally, and they rejected private ownership and militarism of any kind. Births and deaths weren't registered for fear of conscription, and marriages weren't registered as the Doukhobors believed this implied the wrongful ownership of one person by another. Many of their beliefs were to bring conflict to the Doukhobors in Canada. In spite of the early promises of religious freedom, the Canadian government proved harsh and inflexible to those with different ideas. A conflict over land ownership was to nearly destroy the new community. To claim their homesteads, the government insisted the Doukhobors swear an oath of allegiance to the Queen, and would not permit them to register the land communally according to their beliefs. The majority of Doukhobors refused, rejecting private ownership, fearing conscription, and believing their only allegiance could be to God. Over 200,000 acres were lost to these Doukhobors. The government seized the land and offered it for sale to new immigrants. The rush to buy the confiscated land was so large it had to be contained by the RCMP. This conflict was to divide the Doukhobors into three distinct groups. Those who lost their land left for British Columbia, where they became known as the Community Doukhobors. Those who stayed behind were known as independents. A smaller number separated from both these groups. Called the Sons of Freedom, they began almost a century of opposition to assimilation of the Doukhobors. The Sons of Freedom gained public attention for their new demonstrations and for burning Doukhobor and government property to protest militarism and materialism.
When people ask me how was it that the Sons of Freedom came into being, I have to go back to the days of persecution in Russia, particularly during the time of their